Elara walked through the cold, dark hallways of the Sector 7 animal shelter. The air smelled of rust, metal, and heavy silence. At the end of the hall sat a cage covered in heavy energy shields. Red warning lights pulsed like a heartbeat, screaming of danger. Inside was a creature with pitch-black fur and 3 glowing violet eyes. It didn't meow, it hummed like a mysterious radio signal from deep space. Not that one, the manager warned, his voice shaking. That is a Void-Claw. It's a monster that killed its last 3 owners, while everyone else ran away in fear. Elara reached out. To her surprise, the monster didn't attack, it leaned in, seeking her touch. I'll take him, she said. The manager's hands shook as he handed her the papers. Don't say I didn't warn you. It is waiting for something. The air inside the Sector 7 animal shelter was cold and heavy. It smelled like rusted metal and the sharp sting of ozone. Elara walked slowly through the narrow hallways, her heavy boots clicking on the steel floor. She was a spaceship mechanic, a woman who spent her days fixing broken engines and her nights in a silent, empty apartment. Her hands were stained with oil that never truly came off, and her heart felt just as worn out as the machines she repaired. She was tired of the silence. She needed a friend, something to come home to, even if that something wasn't human. The shelter was a sad place. It was located in the darkest corner of the space station, where the sun's light never reached. In the cages, strange creatures from across the galaxy made lonely noises. Some chirped, some hissed, and others simply stared with too many eyes. Elara passed a cage filled with glowing blue lizards and another with a soft, furry creature that looked like a cloud. But none of them felt right. They were too simple, too easy. She wanted a connection that felt real. At the end of the long hall, the lights began to flicker. The temperature dropped even further, and Elara felt a strange chill run down her spine. There, in the deepest part of the room, sat a single cage. Unlike the others, this one was covered in thick, heavy energy shields. Red warning lights pulsed around the frame, casting a bloody glow on the floor. A sign on the wall read, "Danger, Class 5 Predator. Do not approach. You don't want to go near that one," a voice rasped from the shadows. Elara jumped and turned around. It was the shelter manager, an alien named Vrax. He had 4 eyes that moved independently and skin the color of a bruised plum. He was holding a stun baton tightly in his shaking hands. He looked at the shielded cage with pure hatred, and a lot of fear. "That thing is not a pet, human," Vrax whispered, his voice trembling. "It is a Xandarian Void-Claw. It is the most hated creature in this sector. We found it in the wreckage of a ghost ship. It has already killed its last 3 owners. They didn't even have time to scream. It's a monster. A mistake of nature." Elara didn't move. She looked at the red lights and the heavy shields. "What did they do to it?" she asked softly. Vrax puffed out his chest. "They tried to train it. They tried to make it obey. But you cannot tame a shadow. It doesn't eat, it doesn't sleep, and it doesn't love. It only watches. We are only keeping it here until the council gives us permission to dispose of it." Elara ignored the manager's warning. Something pulled her toward the cage. As she stepped closer, the humming sound of the energy shield grew louder, vibrating in her teeth. She peered through the glowing red fence. At first, she saw nothing but darkness. Then, the darkness moved. The creature was the size of a large earth cat, but that was where the similarity ended. Its fur was pitch black, so dark that it seemed to absorb the light around it. Small sparks of purple energy danced along its spine like tiny lightning bolts. It had long, sharp ears and a tail that moved like a snake. But it was the eyes that stopped Elara's breath. It had 3 of them. 2 were where they should be, and a third sat in the middle of its forehead. All 3 glowed with a deep, haunting violet light. The creature didn't meow. It didn't hiss. Instead, it opened its mouth and made a sound that Elara had heard 1,000 times in the engine rooms of massive starships. It was a low, rhythmic hum, like a radio signal searching for a station. It was a lonely sound. It was the sound of something waiting to be heard. He's beautiful, Elara breathed. He's a killer. Vrax shouted, staying 10 feet back. Look at the claws. They can slice through reinforced steel. Get away from the glass, Elara. But Elara didn't move away. Instead, she did something that made Vrax drop his stun baton in shock. She reached out her hand. Slowly, carefully, she pressed her palm against the cold glass of the energy shield. The blue sparks of the shield bit at her skin, but she didn't flinch. Inside the cage, the Void-Claw froze. Its 3 violet eyes locked onto Elara's face. The silence in the room became absolute. For a long moment, the creature didn't move. Vrax held his breath, expecting the glass to shatter and the monster to tear the woman apart. Then, the unexpected happened. The Void-Claw stood up. It walked toward the glass with a slow, graceful movement. It didn't growl. It didn't show its claws. It leaned its head forward until its nose was just inches away from Elara's hand, separated only by the glowing energy. The purple sparks on its fur calmed down, turning into a soft, gentle glow. It hummed again, but this time, the sound was warm. He's not a monster, Elara said, her voice firm. She turned to look at the terrified manager. He's just alone. Just like me. Vrax looked at the creature, then at Elara. His 4 eyes were wide with disbelief. You're crazy. This is a death sentence. I want him, Elara said. I'll pay the fee. Give me the papers. Vrax's hands shook so much he could barely hold the digital pad. He hurried to the desk and processed the adoption as fast as he could, as if he wanted the creature gone before it changed its mind. He didn't even charge her the full price. He just wanted the Void-Claw out of his shelter. As he handed Elara the ownership chip, he leaned in, his voice dropping to a terrified whisper. You think you've saved him, human. But look at him. He didn't fight you. He didn't run. He's been sitting in that cage for months, waiting. Everyone thought he was waiting for a chance to kill. Elara looked back at the cage. The Void-Claw was sitting perfectly still, staring at the exit of the shelter with an intensity that was frightening. He wasn't waiting for a home, Elara, Vrax whispered, his eyes darting around the dark room. He's waiting for something else. Something is coming, and that creature knows it. Don't say I didn't warn you. When the screaming starts, Elara looked at her new companion. The cat-like creature looked back at her, its 3rd eye blinking slowly. For the first time in years, Elara didn't feel lonely. But as she walked out of the shelter with the monster, in a heavy transport box, she couldn't shake the manager's words. What exactly was Midnight waiting for? The journey back to Elara's apartment was filled with an uncomfortable silence. She carried the heavy transport box through the industrial corridors of Sector 7, feeling the weight of the creature inside. Usually, an animal would kick or scratch at the walls of a cage, but Midnight was perfectly still. The only sign that he was alive was the faint, low-frequency hum vibrating through the metal handle of the box. It felt like holding a live power cable. People moved out of Elara's way as she passed. They didn't know what was in the box, but they could feel the strange energy coming from it. The air around the box seemed to shimmer and blur, as if the creature inside was bending the very light of the hallway. When Elara finally reached her small, one-room apartment, she felt a wave of relief. Her home was a mess of half-finished engines, hanging wires, and metal scraps. It was a mechanic's workshop first and a home second. She set the box down in the center of the floor and took a deep breath. Her heart was hammering against her ribs. She was about to let the most feared predator in the sector loose in her living room. With a trembling finger, she pressed the release button. The heavy energy shields hissed and deactivated, and the metal door slid open with a soft thud. For a long minute, nothing happened. Then, a single, pitch-black paw stepped out onto the cold floor. It didn't make a sound. Midnight slid out of the box like liquid shadow. In the dim light of the apartment, his fur seemed to pulse with a soft, purple glow. He didn't run or hide under the bed. Instead, he stood in the middle of the room and looked around with his 3 violet eyes. He wasn't looking at the furniture, He was looking at the walls, the ceiling, and the vents, as if he were scanning the room for hidden threats. Elara had prepared a bowl of high-quality synthetic meat, the kind usually given to expensive alien pets. She placed it on the floor and stepped back. "Here you go, Midnight. You must be hungry." The creature walked over to the bowl, sniffed it once, and then did something Elara had never seen. He didn't eat the meat. Instead, he turned his head toward the wall where a large power generator was humming. He walked over to the thick electrical cables and placed his paw on them. Suddenly, the lights in the apartment flickered and dimmed. The purple glow on Midnight's fur grew incredibly bright. He wasn't eating food, he was drinking the electricity directly from the station's power grid. As night fell over the station, marked only by the artificial dimming of the overhead lights, the atmosphere in the apartment changed. Elara tried to relax on her small sofa, but she felt like she was being watched. Midnight wasn't acting like a cat at all. He didn't sleep. He sat by the front door, his body perfectly still, staring at the heavy metal lock. Every few minutes, his third eye would blink, and a soft click would echo in the room. Elara realized with a shiver that the clicking was coming from her own computer and radio. Midnight was somehow interacting with the electronics in her home, sending out silent signals that she couldn't understand. Around midnight, a strange sound began to fill the room. It wasn't a meow or a growl. It was a whisper. It sounded like dozens of voices talking at once, but very far away, like a radio station stuck between channels. Elara sat up, her skin crawling with fear. "Midnight," she whispered. The creature's fur stood up like needles. The purple sparks jumping off his back were now red. He wasn't looking at Elara, he was looking at the ventilation shaft above her bed. His low hum turned into a sharp, piercing whistle. Suddenly, there was a loud, aggressive pounding on the front door. Elara jumped, her heart nearly stopping. It was her neighbor, Mr. Grack, a grumpy alien with thick scales and a short temper. "Open up, human," he shouted through the door. "My scanners are going crazy. You brought a Class 5 monster into this building. I can smell the void energy through the walls. Get that thing out of here before I call the station security to vent your whole apartment into space." Elara walked to the door, her hands shaking. She looked through the viewer and saw Grack holding a scanning device that was beeping wildly. But before she could speak, she felt a cold presence at her feet. Midnight was standing right against the door. He wasn't hissing at Grack. He was doing something much stranger. He was pressed against the metal door, and his body was becoming semi-transparent. It looked as if he were trying to phase through the solid steel to get to the person on the other side. "Grack, please." "He's not doing anything," Elara yelled back. But just as she said it, the lights in the entire hallway outside the apartment exploded. She heard Grack scream in the sudden darkness. The whispering sound became a roar in Elara's ears. Midnight turned his head away from the door and looked directly at the thick outer hull of the space station, the wall that separated them from the cold, empty vacuum of space. He let out a sound that wasn't a hum or a whistle. It was a warning. Elara realized then that Grack wasn't the reason Midnight was upset. Midnight wasn't looking at the door because of the neighbor. He was looking at the door because he was guarding her. And he wasn't looking at the wall because he was curious. He was looking at the wall because something was scratching on the outside of the ship. Something huge. Something that shouldn't be there. The manager's words echoed in her head, "He's waiting for something." Elara looked at her cat, whose third eye was now glowing a terrifying, blood-red color. The suspense was suffocating. Whatever Midnight had been waiting for in that shelter, it had finally found them. The scratching sound against the outer hull of the space station slowly faded, leaving a silence that was even more terrifying. Elara stood in the center of her dark apartment, her breathing shallow and fast. Midnight remained frozen by the wall, his three eyes glowing like dying embers in a fire. The red glow on his fur slowly transitioned back to a deep, pulsing purple. He looked at Elara, and for a second, she felt a strange sensation in her mind, not words, but a feeling of safety. The monster was telling her that the immediate danger had passed, but his body remained tense, like a spring ready to snap. The next few days were a blur of strange occurrences and growing dread. Elara noticed that Midnight didn't move like a normal living creature. Sometimes, she would see him sitting on the kitchen counter, and a second later, without any sound of movement, he would be sitting across the room by the window. It wasn't just speed, it was as if he were stepping through folds in reality. Even more surprising was his effect on her work. Elara brought home a broken navigation core, a piece of technology so damaged that most engineers had given up on it. As she worked on it with her tools, Midnight hopped onto the table. He let out a low, melodic hum, and his third eye emitted a thin beam of violet light. To Elara's absolute shock, the burnt circuits inside the core began to knit themselves back together. The cat was repairing the machine with his own energy. However, the station's atmosphere was becoming toxic. Word had spread that Elara was keeping the Void-Claw, her neighbors avoided her in the hallways, and the station's security drones began hovering outside her window more frequently. The fear was palpable. One afternoon, while Elara was deep in the lower levels of the station fixing a massive cooling pipe, tragedy nearly struck. The station was old, and the maintenance was poor. Without warning, a heavy hydraulic support beam snapped. Tons of reinforced steel began to groan and slide directly toward Elara. She was pinned against a wall with nowhere to run. She closed her eyes, bracing for the end, whispering a small apology to the universe. Suddenly, the air grew incredibly cold. She heard a sound like a thunderclap inside the small room. When she opened her eyes, she wasn't crushed. Midnight was standing between her and the falling beam. But he didn't look like a cat anymore. He had grown larger, his shadows expanding to form a shield of solid darkness that held the massive weight of the steel beam. He was phasing in and out of existence, his three eyes burning with a fierce, protective light. With a powerful shove of his shadow paws, he tossed the multi-ton beam aside as if it were made of paper. He had saved her life, using strength that no animal should possess. Trembling, Elara hugged the creature. His fur felt like soft silk and static electricity. "Who are you?" she whispered. "What are you?" Midnight simply purred, a sound that vibrated through her very bones, calming her racing heart. She knew she couldn't keep living in ignorance. She needed to know the truth about what she had brought home. That night, she used her master mechanic's override key to sneak into the station's restricted digital archives. She spent hours bypassing firewalls and encryption layers that were designed to hide the galaxy's darkest secrets. Deep within the classified files of the Xandarian Empire, she finally found it: Project Aegis. The file contained images of creatures that looked exactly like Midnight. They weren't natural animals evolved on a distant planet. They were bioengineered, guardian soldiers, created thousands of years ago. The Xandarians had tried to create the ultimate bodyguard, a creature that could phase through walls, manipulate energy, and sense danger before it happened. But the project was labeled a total failure. The files stated that the Void-Claws were uncontrollable and highly aggressive. They had turned on their creators and had to be hunted into near extinction, but as Elara read further, her eyes filled with tears of anger. The Xandarians had treated these creatures like soulless weapons. They had kept them in pain collars, never gave them names, and used electric shocks to force them to fight. The aliens didn't understand why the Void-Claws were aggressive. They thought they were monsters because they didn't obey orders. But Elara, with her human heart, saw the truth. These creatures weren't weapons, they were highly emotional beings that required a deep, psychic bond with a partner. The Xandarians had tried to be their masters, but the Void-Claws were looking for friends. The most hated alien was simply a creature that had been heartbroken for 1,000 years. As Elara closed the file, she felt a presence behind her. She turned to see Midnight sitting on the computer console. He looked at the screen, then at her. For the first time, Elara saw a flicker of sadness in his violet eyes. He knew what she had found. He knew his own history. Elara reached out and scratched him behind his long, pointed ears. "They were wrong about you, Midnight," she said softly. "You're not a failure. They just didn't know how to love you." Midnight leaned into her hand, his third eye closing in a sign of total trust. But the moment of peace was shattered. Suddenly, every alarm on the Sector 7 space station began to scream. The lights turned a deep, emergency red. A voice boomed over the intercom, warning. Unknown fleet detected in Sector 7. Scanners identifying the swarm. All citizens to the escape pods immediately. This is not a drill, Elara felt a cold chill. The scratching on the hull from the night before hadn't been a random event. It had been a scout. The swarm, the most ruthless, hive-minded invaders in the galaxy, had arrived. And they weren't here to talk. Midnight stood up, his fur turning into sharp, black needles. He looked at the door and then at Elara. The time for waiting was over. The monster was ready to become the guardian he was always meant to be. The sound of the alarms was deafening, a high-pitched scream that echoed through the metallic bones of Sector 7. In an instant, the peaceful silence of the station was replaced by pure, unadulterated panic. Elara could hear the heavy thud of boots in the hallway and the terrified cries of families running toward the escape pods. But above the human noise, there was something far worse. It was a wet, clicking sound, the sound of thousands of sharp legs moving against metal. The swarm had arrived. They were a hive-minded race of insect-like monsters that didn't want gold or land, they only wanted to consume every living thing in their path. Elara grabbed her heavy wrench and looked at Midnight. The creature was no longer the calm, purring companion from the night before. His body was low to the ground, his tail lashing back and forth like a whip of dark energy. The purple sparks on his fur had turned into a violent, hissing flame of black fire. He wasn't looking at the door, he was looking at the ceiling. Suddenly, the metal plates above them began to groan. With a terrifying crash, a swarm soldier burst through the ventilation shaft. It was a nightmare of green chitin, dripping acid from its mandibles, and 4 glowing red eyes. It let out a screech that shattered the glass of Elara's workbench. Before Elara could even raise her wrench, a blur of black and purple light flashed past her. Midnight hit the swarm soldier with the force of a falling star. The cat was no longer small. As he moved, his body seemed to stretch and grow, his shadows expanding until he looked like a panther made of starlight and smoke. With one swift motion of his glowing claws, he tore through the insect's thick armor as if it were wet paper. The swarm soldier didn't even have time to scream before it vanished into a cloud of purple dust. Midnight landed silently, his 3 eyes fixed on the hole in the ceiling. He wasn't just defending himself, he was hunting. That we have to go, Midnight. The pods. Elara shouted, grabbing a small emergency pack. She ran into the hallway, but the scene was a massacre. The station's power grid was failing, and the lights were flickering between darkness and a sickly emergency red. The swarm was everywhere. She saw her neighbor, Mr. Grack, trapped against a wall by 3 swarm soldiers. Grack, the man who had called Midnight a monster, was now paralyzed with fear. Without thinking, Elara ran toward them, but she knew she was too slow. The lead insect raised a jagged, bone-like blade to strike that heartbeat. The air in the hallway seemed to freeze. A low, vibrating hum filled the corridor, so loud that it made the walls vibrate. Midnight didn't just run, he phased through the floor and reappeared directly in front of Grack. But he wasn't a cat anymore, and he wasn't just a panther. He had transformed into his true, Alpha Guardian, form. He stood 7 feet tall, a terrifying creature of shadow with 6 long, blade-like limbs and wings made of pure void energy. His 3 eyes were no longer violet, they were a blinding white light that seemed to burn the very air. The swarm soldiers hissed and backed away. For the first time in their history, these mindless killers felt something they didn't understand, fear. Midnight let out a roar that wasn't a sound, but a psychic shockwave. The force of it sent the swarm soldiers flying backward, their armor cracking and breaking against the bulkheads. With movements too fast for the human eye to follow, Midnight moved through the hallway like a ghost. He was a whirlwind of shadow and light, protecting the very people who had spent weeks wishing he was dead. He moved between the civilians and the invaders, a wall of darkness that nothing could pass. Elara watched in awe as her pet took on an entire army. Every time a swarm soldier tried to get close to a human, Midnight was there, his claws glowing with the power of a dying sun. He was beautiful and terrifying all at once. But the battle was far from over. From the end of the long corridor, a much larger presence emerged. The Swarm Queen's Guard, a massive, armored beast the size of a small tank, slowly crawled into view. Its armor was reinforced with stolen tech, and its claws were dripping with a deadly neurotoxin. It looked at Midnight and let out a challenge that made the entire station shake. Elara realized that Midnight was exhausted. His shadows were flickering, and the purple glow on his fur was fading. He had used too much energy protecting the neighbors. The giant swarm guard charged, its heavy feet denting the steel floor with every step. Elara knew that even with his powers, Midnight might not survive a direct hit from a beast that large. She looked around and saw a high-voltage power cable hanging from the ceiling, sparking with leftover energy. She remembered how Midnight had eaten the electricity on his first night. Midnight! Catch! Elara screamed. She grabbed a metal rod and slammed it into the power box, rerouting the station's main backup battery into the hanging cable. She swung the sparking wire toward her guardian. Midnight understood instantly. He jumped into the air, catching the cable in his mouth. Thousands of volts of pure energy poured into his body. His fur erupted in a massive explosion of light, and his power levels surged beyond the limit. He didn't just hit the swarm guard, he vaporized it. The explosion of light was so bright that Elara had to shield her eyes. When the smoke cleared, the hallway was empty of enemies, but the station was falling apart. They were safe for now, but the true master of the swarm was still coming. The explosion of light left the hallway in a haunting, dusty silence. The air was thick with the smell of burnt metal and the green, acidic blood of the swarm. Elara leaned against the wall, her lungs burning from the smoke. Midnight, still in his large, shadowy form, stood over the remains of the giant guard. His fur was still crackling with the electricity he had absorbed, but his movements were heavy. He was tired. The energy boost had saved them, but his body was under a massive strain. Every few seconds, his form would flicker, threatening to return to the shape of a small, helpless cat. But he refused to let go. He could feel it, the true master of this invasion was finally stepping onto the station. The floor began to vibrate with a low, rhythmic thumping that felt like a giant heartbeat. From the shadows of the main hangar, a figure emerged that made the previous swarm soldiers look like toys. This was the Swarm Dominator. It stood nearly 12 feet tall, with a body covered in shimmering, black obsidian armor that reflected the flickering emergency lights. It didn't have wings or extra legs, it looked almost like a twisted, bone-white knight. In its hand, it held a blade made of pure energy that hissed as it cut through the air. The Dominator didn't scream or hiss. It spoke. The voice was a collection of 1,000 clicking sounds translated directly into Elara's mind. The Xandarian failure, the voice cold and sharp. You protect the weak meat beings. Why? You were born to destroy, not to serve. Midnight let out a low, rumbling growl that shook the pipes in the walls. He stepped forward, his claws digging into the steel floor, but the Dominator was faster than anything they had faced. The two beings clashed in the center of the hallway, a blur of purple shadow and black obsidian. The sound was like two freight trains colliding. Every time the Dominator's energy blade hit Midnight's shadow shield, sparks of void energy flew everywhere, melting the walls and vaporizing the floor. Elara watched in horror as Midnight was pushed back. The Dominator was smarter and stronger, and it was using a psychic attack, trying to break Midnight's mind. You are a weapon, the Dominator's voice echoed. Surrender, and we will let you live as a king among us. Give us the human, and the pain stops. Midnight wavered. His third eye began to flicker and go dark. The weight of his own history, the thousands of years of being hated and used as a tool, was being used against him by the Dominator's psychic power. He began to shrink, his shadows pulling back toward his body. He looked at Elara, his eyes filled with a sudden, deep fear. He was starting to believe he was just a monster. The Dominator raised its energy blade for the final strike, a cruel smile appearing on its insect-like face. It thought the battle was over. It thought it had won, but the Dominator didn't understand humans. Elara didn't run. She didn't hide. Instead, she grabbed a heavy, discarded metal shield from a fallen security bot and ran directly into the path of the giant monster. She wasn't a soldier, and she had no powers, but she stood between the Dominator and her friend. He's not a weapon, she screamed, her voice echoing through the corridor. He's my friend. And if you want him, you have to go through me. She held the shield up, her arms shaking, knowing she couldn't stop a creature that strong. But she didn't move an inch. She was a small human facing a galactic nightmare, and she wasn't blinking. The Dominator paused, genuinely confused by this display of useless bravery. But for Midnight, seeing Elara risk her life for him changed everything. In that moment, the final lock on his power shattered. He realized he didn't have to be what the Xandarians made him, or what the Swarm wanted him to be. He was what Elara saw in him. A sudden wave of warmth and golden energy, human emotion, poured from Elara into Midnight. His fur didn't just glow purple, it erupted in a blinding, pure white light. He grew even larger, his shadow becoming solid as stone. He let out a psychic roar that was so powerful it blew out every camera and sensor on the station. The roar wasn't just a sound, it was a command. It told the Swarm that this territory belonged to a guardian. Midnight leaped, his speed so great that he seemed to exist in 3 places at once. He caught the Dominator's energy blade in his bare shadow claws and snapped it like a dry twig. With a final, massive burst of void energy, he slammed his paws into the Dominator's chest. The obsidian armor shattered into a million pieces. The Swarm leader didn't even have time to scream as it was thrown through the hull of the ship, launched into the cold vacuum of space. Without their leader, the remaining Swarm soldiers on the station began to screech in pain and retreat, scurrying back to their ships in total terror. The battle was won, but as the white light faded, Midnight collapsed to the floor, his body shrinking back into the form of a small, tired black cat. The silence that followed the battle was heavier than the noise of the war. Dust settled on the cold metal floor, and the only sound was the distant hum of the station's life support system struggling to restart. Elara sat on the floor, her clothes torn and her face covered in soot. In her lap lay Midnight. He was small again, no bigger than a regular house cat. His third eye was closed, and his breathing was shallow. He looked so fragile that it was hard to believe he had just defeated a galactic warlord. Around them, the survivors of Sector 7 began to emerge from the shadows. Mr. Grack and the other neighbors stood at a distance, looking at the small black cat with a mix of terror and deep respect. They realized that if it weren't for the monster, they would all be dead, but the peace did not last long. Within an hour, the station's hangar bay was filled with the sound of high-tech engines. 3 silver ships, sleek and intimidating, landed. These were not the Swarm, they were the Galactic Council peacekeepers. A group of tall, thin aliens in white armor marched into the hallway, led by a High Inquisitor with skin like polished marble. They didn't come to help the injured or offer food. They came with heavy containment fields and energy shackles. The Inquisitor looked at the destroyed Swarm soldiers and then pointed a long, glowing finger at Midnight. "There it is," the Inquisitor said, his voice cold and robotic. "The illegal bioweapon. Project Aegis. Soldiers, secure the creature and prepare it for immediate disintegration." The soldiers moved forward, their weapons aimed not at the debris, but at the small cat in Elara's arms. Elara felt a surge of cold fury. She stood up, pulling Midnight closer to her chest. "He's not a weapon," she shouted, her voice echoing through the corridor. He just saved this entire station. He saved your citizens while you were hiding in the safety of the inner rim. The Inquisitor didn't stop. Human, you do not understand. That creature is a mistake. It was designed to destroy entire civilizations. It is unstable, dangerous, and has no soul. It must be erased from the galaxy to ensure peace. The soldiers surrounded Elara, their energy rifles humming as they powered up. Midnight stirred in Elara's arms, his violet eyes opening just a crack. He was too weak to fight again. He looked up at Elara, and for the first time, he let out a tiny, soft meow, a sound of pure sadness. He was ready to give up. He had spent his whole life being hunted, and he expected no different now. But Elara didn't move. She stood her ground, a lone human mechanic facing the most powerful army in the galaxy. You say he has no soul because he wouldn't obey your orders, she said, her voice shaking with emotion. But he obeyed the call to protect the innocent. He didn't fight because he was programmed to. He fought because he chose to. That is more soul than any of you have. Then, something unexpected happened. Mr. Grack, the grumpy neighbor who had once tried to get Midnight evicted, stepped forward. He stood next to Elara. Then, a mother holding her child stepped forward. One by one, the survivors of Sector 7 formed a human and alien wall around Elara and Midnight. They weren't soldiers, and they didn't have energy rifles. They only had their shared experience of being saved by a monster. Grack looked at the Inquisitor and growled, "If you want the cat, you have to take all of us. He is one of us now. He is a citizen of Sector 7. The Inquisitor paused. He looked at the diverse group of beings standing together in solidarity. In all his centuries of ruling, he had never seen different species protect the Void-Claw. The logic of the Council did not compute this. To them, a weapon was a weapon. But to these people, the weapon had become a hero. The tension in the hallway was so thick it felt like it might explode. The soldiers waited for the order to fire, but the Inquisitor saw the cameras. The entire station was watching. If he attacked now, he would start a rebellion. Humans, he realized, had a strange way of turning the most hated things into the most loved. With a look of pure disgust, the Inquisitor lowered his hand. "Fine," he hissed. "Keep your monster. But know this, the Council will no longer protect this station. If that creature loses control, your blood will be on your own hands." He turned and marched back to his ship, his soldiers following close behind. As the silver ships took off and vanished into the stars, a massive cheer erupted in the hallway. People who had lived as strangers for years were now hugging each other, laughing and crying. They had survived the swarm, and they had survived the Council. The story of the cat of Sector 7 spread across the galaxy. It became a legend, the story of a girl who saw a friend where everyone else saw a freak. Elara and Midnight went back to their quiet life, but it wasn't so quiet anymore. Their apartment was always filled with gifts of electricity and treats from the neighbors. Midnight never had to sit in a cage again. On clear nights, Elara would sit by the window, looking out at the vast, dark space. Midnight would sit on her shoulder, his 3 eyes glowing softly. He wasn't waiting for a war anymore. He was just a cat, finally home, purring a song of peace that could be felt across the entire station. In a universe of cold stars and heartless empires, humanity had proven that even the most hated monster just needs a place to belong.